What would you do if you walked out into your backyard and found a wedding planner setting up a floral arch over your pool without your permission? That's exactly what happened to me. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. A woman I'd met, the HOA president from the next neighborhood over, tried to commandeer my pool for her daughter's wedding. No phone call, no request, no discussion, just full-blown wedding takeover. And when I told her to stop, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "It's already happening." That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with your average overbearing neighbor. I was dealing with a full-blown HOA Karen, and this was war. It all started with a Saturday morning that should have been peaceful. I'd poured myself a hot cup of coffee and was settling into my favorite deck chair by the pool. The water sparkled under the early sun, the jasmine on the trellis had just started to bloom, and a hummingbird hovered near the feeder like something out of a postcard. My backyard was my sanctuary, a space I'd built myself over the course of 5 years. Every stone in the patio laid by hand, the pool remodeled with my own savings. Even the flower beds were arranged in the same pattern my grandmother had used. It was the kind of place that told you who I was without saying a word. And most importantly, it sat just outside the jurisdiction of the neighboring HOA, which was perfect because I never wanted any part of their nitpicky, lawn-measuring nonsense. That's when the voice pierced my morning calm like a jackhammer. "Excuse me, are you the homeowner?" she asked. I turned to see a woman standing stiffly at the edge of my backyard, hands on hips, lips pursed like she was trying to inhale a lemon. She wore a power suit on a Saturday and clutched a clipboard like it was a weapon. I knew immediately who she was: Eleanor Vance, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I'd heard about her from a few neighbors, how she fined a guy for having mismatched patio chairs, tried to ban wind chimes, and once called code enforcement on a kid's lemonade stand. She was famous for ruining things that made other people happy. I gave her a nod and said, "Yep, this is my place. Something I can help you with." She didn't smile. Instead, she took a few steps closer, close enough to violate what I call peaceful stranger distance. Then she launched into her speech. "I'm here on behalf of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. We've received multiple complaints about your pool area. It's visible from the upper lots of our community, and, well, the aesthetic clashes with the neighborhood theme." I blinked. "You mean my backyard?" She nodded, all business. "Yes, it's quite vibrant. The blue tile, the umbrella colors very tropical. We prefer more neutral palettes in Willow Creek." I just stared. She continued, "We'd like you to consider putting up a visual barrier, something tasteful. Perhaps a beige privacy wall, just to keep everything uniform." Now, I'll admit, I laughed. Not just a chuckle, an actual belly laugh. This woman was standing on my property, asking me to change my backyard because it didn't match the vibes of a place I didn't even live in. "I'm not part of your HOA, I said. "My property isn't under your jurisdiction. You can't dictate what I do here." Eleanor didn't flinch. "Technically, yes. But when properties are adjacent, it creates what we call a shared visual impact zone." I raised an eyebrow. "You just made that up, didn't you?" She smiled tightly, as if to say she'd deal with me later, and left with a clipped, "We'll be in touch." At that point, I figured that was the end of it. Just another crazy HOA president trying to flex her invisible power. I didn't think she'd actually try anything else. But Eleanor wasn't the type to leave things unfinished. A week later, I got an envelope in the mail with official-looking letterhead, "Notification of Temporary Use Authorization." It stated that my pool area had been approved for use as a venue for the upcoming wedding of Olivia Vance, Eleanor's daughter. My jaw dropped. It said I'd agreed to lend my property as a good neighbor gesture, and that setup would begin the following Monday. There was no phone number, no signature from me, just a stamped approval and a checklist of installation dates. I thought maybe it was a mistake, maybe some clerical error. So I called the number at the bottom of the page, and sure enough, Eleanor herself answered. "Oh, wonderful," she said as if we were old friends. "I'm so glad you got the letter. I knew you'd come around." I told her I absolutely did not approve of any wedding on my property. She sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "The invitations have already gone out," she said. "We can't cancel now. It would be a disaster for my daughter. Think of the optics. Think of the trespassing charges," I replied, but she just said, "We'll talk Monday," and hung up. On Monday morning, I was ready. I had a copy of my property deed in hand, a no trespassing sign printed and mounted by the gate, and I'd even called a lawyer friend for advice. I thought I was prepared, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I stepped outside. There were trucks, caterers, a wedding planner with a headset barking instructions, a man on a ladder stringing fairy lights across my pergola. They were setting up tables around my pool, laying out white linens and floral centerpieces. The sound system was being tested, soft classical music echoing across my lawn. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Eleanor, arms crossed, beaming like she owned the place. I walked straight up to her and said, "You need to stop this right now. None of this was approved. You're trespassing." She gave me that same tight smile, then handed me a printed contract with my forged signature. "We've already made accommodations," she said. "You'll be compensated for any damages, and of course, we'll clean up afterward. But let's not ruin a young woman's special day." I looked at the fake contract, then back at her smug face, and in that moment, something in me snapped. Not with rage, but with a kind of cold, calculated clarity. If Eleanor wanted to use my pool for a wedding, then she was going to get the most memorable wedding of her life, just not the kind she'd planned. I said nothing, just nodded slowly, turned around, and went back inside. Because I had an idea. A very bubbly, very satisfying idea. The next morning, I woke up with a plan, and for once, it didn't involve yelling, threatening, or dragging anyone to court. Not yet anyway. I'd dealt with petty people before, but Eleanor was something else entirely. She wasn't just trying to control things. She was trying to bulldoze her way into my life with fake contracts, false authority, and an army of people who didn't seem to question anything she said. It was like a cult of lawn perfection and passive-aggressive social terrorism. But if she was going to double down on her insanity, then I was going to dig in and get smart about this. First, I needed to make sure she had zero legal standing. I called my lawyer friend again, a guy named David who specialized in real estate disputes. He's the type who wears flip-flops to court and still manages to win cases. I told him everything, from the fake contract to the unwanted event prep to the threats she'd made over the phone. He just laughed. "She's out of her mind," he said. "As long as you haven't signed anything, and that signature doesn't match yours, by the way, you're totally in the clear. But document everything. Take photos, get videos. If she steps foot on your land again, call the sheriff." That's exactly what I did. I spent the next 2 days setting up security cameras, nothing fancy, just enough to cover the gates, the pool area, and the back corner where they were trying to sneak in supplies. I even added a motion-activated floodlight, just for dramatic effect. That same afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up again. The driver hopped out and started unloading what looked like a wedding arch. White metal, twinkling string lights, and a couple of fake floral arrangements. I walked out and asked him who authorized the delivery. Eleanor Vance," he said, reading off a clipboard. "She said you were the property owner's cousin and gave permission." I shook my head, told him to put everything back in the truck, and politely informed him he was participating in trespassing if he left anything behind. He didn't argue, but Eleanor didn't back off. Instead, she sent me a new letter, on HOA letterhead no less, saying that my refusal to comply with the community's event planning standards could result in legal consequences, including being sued for emotional distress. That was a new one. Emotional distress because I didn't want 200 strangers in formal wear traipsing through my garden to take selfies next to my pool. I sent the letter straight to David, who replied with a laughing emoji and said, "Want me to send a cease and desist? Or do you want to have a little fun first?" Fun sounded better. The next day, I caught a glimpse of Eleanor walking along the sidewalk with a group of well-dressed women, other HOA board members judging by the way they walked like they owned the place. She waved at me, pretending like we were old pals who were just ironing out a few last-minute wedding details. One of the women even asked if they could use my outdoor bar to set up the cake display. That's when I knew they really believed they could pull this off. They had no intention of backing down, no matter what I said. So I stopped telling them no. I stopped arguing. I smiled, nodded, and said, "Of course, whatever you need." Because I was going to give them exactly what they were asking for, but on my terms. The next morning, I made some calls. One was to my cousin Chloe, who used to run a mobile phone party business back in the day. I asked her a very specific question. How much bubble solution would it take to turn my pool into a frothy explosion of chaos? She laughed for a solid minute before giving me the name of a supplier and telling me the mix ratio. I ordered 6 gallons of industrial-strength, non-toxic bubble solution. Then I called my buddy Mark, who builds custom pond filters, and asked him if he could rig my pool's pump to circulate the bubbles without burning out the motor. He said it was doable with the right setup and a timer. I spent the next 3 nights prepping. During the day, I kept playing the friendly neighbor. I let the wedding planner do her site checks. I nodded along while Eleanor monologued about white roses and signature cocktails. I watched quietly as tables were set up and rented chairs were placed in neat rows along my patio. Every now and then, I'd offer lemonade. I even let one of the groomsmen take a nap on my hammock. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I was rigging my pool like it was the set of a prank show. The pump was ready, the solution was hidden in sealed drums behind my shed, and the timer was set for precisely noon on Saturday, the moment the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The day before the wedding, Eleanor came by one final time. She looked pleased with herself, like a queen inspecting her domain. "We'll be out of here by 7, she said confidently. "You won't even know we were here." I smiled and told her I hoped everything went beautifully. Then I watched as she sashayed off in her heels, clipboard swinging like a sword. She had no idea what was coming. That night, I double-checked everything. Timer set, cameras rolling, bubble drums connected. And just for good measure, I told my neighbors what was going down. Not all of them liked Eleanor either. In fact, some of them offered to bring snacks and lawn chairs so they could watch. I even caught one teenager betting $10 that Eleanor would fall in before the ceremony ended. There was a strange sense of solidarity growing in the neighborhood, a quiet rebellion against the tyranny of the HOA, and I was about to light the fuse. By Saturday morning, the place looked like a high-budget movie set. Floral garlands draped across the fence, string lights hung between the trees, a string quartet tuned up in the corner while guests milled about sipping mimosas. I stood inside, sipping coffee, watching through the blinds. It was oddly peaceful knowing that the chaos I'd engineered was about to unfold. And unlike Eleanor's last-minute planning, mine was timed to a T. At precisely 11:59 a.m., I walked out onto my porch with a fresh cup of coffee and took a seat. Eleanor saw me and gave a smug little wave, as if to say, "See? We won." I raised my mug in return, smiled back, and thought, "You have no idea." Then I heard it. The soft hum of the pump kicking on, the calm before the storm. The water in the pool began to ripple gently. At first, it looked like nothing, just a bit of foam collecting around the edges. Then more and more. And then, all at once, it erupted. Bubbles exploded across the surface like a slow-motion tidal wave of foam. The white froth piled up, spilling over the edges, crawling toward the carefully arranged chairs. Guests gasped. One woman shrieked. Eleanor spun around just in time to see her dream wedding ceremony engulfed in what could only be described as a frothy disaster. I leaned back in my chair and took another sip. The show had just begun. If you had told me a month ago that I'd be using my pool pump to unleash a tidal wave of bubbles on an uninvited wedding, I'd have laughed in your face. But here we were, one Eleanor away from losing all sense of reality. The idea wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming control. Eleanor had marched into my life, forced her will onto my property, forged a contract, and used her position like some twisted HOA dictator. She didn't just want my pool. She wanted to humiliate me into submission. But I had a different plan. I wasn't going to scream, argue, or call the cops. I was going to outplay her with soap. The moment I saw that first puff of foam swell across the pool, I knew I'd nailed the timing. I'd tested everything twice the night before. The pump strength, the solution's froth potential, the time delay, even the wind direction. And as the clock struck noon, everything went exactly as planned. Guests who had been casually fanning themselves in the sun and sipping cucumber water suddenly turned their heads. A woman in a pastel pink hat let out a confused, "Oh." Then someone else laughed, thinking it was part of the entertainment. But the laughs quickly turned into yelps as the foam climbed higher, rushing across the surface in waves and spilling over the tile edge. The flower petals arranged by the wedding planner were swallowed in seconds. The white chairs lined along the water's edge vanished under a creeping layer of fluff. And then came the real moment. The bride, Eleanor's daughter, stepped out from the patio doors in a flowing white gown, her veil fluttering behind her. She froze mid-step as she took in the scene, her jaw dropped. Guests turned to look, some raising their phones instinctively. Even the string quartet stopped mid-song, unsure if they were witnessing a prank or a catastrophe. I could see Eleanor, already mid-stride, frozen like a statue. Her head snapped around toward me. She looked livid, eyes wide, face flushed, one heel stuck in the grass. She shouted something I couldn't quite make out, probably a string of obscenities, then started stomping toward me. But the ground was slick. She slipped, not a full fall, but enough of a stumble to ruin whatever dignity she had left. Her shoe flew off and landed in a mound of foam near the diving board. It was beautiful. By now, the foam had completely engulfed the shallow end. One child, laughing, thought it was some kind of bounce house. Another guest tried to fish her purse out from the frothy abyss with a pool skimmer. Someone turned the music up as if to match the chaos. People were trying to walk away from the mess, but foam stuck to everything. Dresses, shoes, chair legs, even the wedding cake stand, which had been stupidly placed on the edge of the pool deck. That entire cake, 3 tiers of white fondant and delicate edible flowers, collapsed into the suds like a melting iceberg. I may or may not have clapped. Eleanor finally made it to my porch, her voice rising an octave with every word. She screamed that this was intentional, that I had sabotaged her daughter's special day. She accused me of harassment, vandalism, and even emotional terrorism, whatever that meant. I let her go on. I just sipped my coffee and let the camera mounted above the door record every second of her tantrum. She waved her clipboard like a sword, yelling about HOA authority and community standards, until I finally spoke. I reminded her that she was standing on my private property at an event I had never consented to, surrounded by guests I didn't invite, all because she decided that her daughter's wedding deserved a free venue at someone else's expense. I told her the pool was mine, the pump was mine, and so were the bubbles. I even leaned in a little and whispered, "You said you wanted a clean aesthetic? Well, nothing says clean like lavender-scented foam." She blinked, stunned, either at the audacity or the fact that I'd remained completely calm while her entire world collapsed into suds. She turned around to look at the guests, now wandering toward the gates, their outfits ruined, their shoes soaked. Some of them were laughing. Others just shook their heads. One woman muttered that she knew this was a bad idea the moment she saw the fake signature claim. A few people even waved at me, as if I'd just hosted the weirdest backyard party of the year. Maybe I had. The bride stood by the back gate, veil drenched, mascara running. She wasn't crying anymore. She just looked exhausted, like she wanted to disappear. Eleanor walked toward her, trying to salvage the situation, but it was far too late. The music had stopped, the bubbles were still flowing, and the entire neighborhood had basically witnessed the greatest wedding fail in Willow Creek history. Eleanor tried calling the police. She actually stood in the middle of my driveway, on the phone, shouting into the receiver like a character in a bad sitcom. She described the scene as a violent soap-based ambush, which I'm fairly sure no officer has ever taken seriously in the history of law enforcement. When the patrol car did arrive 20 minutes later, the officer took one look at the foam-filled yard, the drenched guests, the ruined cake stand, and the clearly livid HOA president, and asked the obvious question. Why was there a wedding here without the homeowner's permission? Eleanor tried explaining the fake agreement, the adjacent property clause, and something about visual territory, but the officer just raised his eyebrows and looked at me. I handed him the real deed, showed him the boundary lines, the no trespassing sign, even played him the voicemail where Eleanor told me it was too late to cancel. He sighed and gave her the most tired look I've ever seen on a man in uniform. Then he told her she was lucky I wasn't pressing charges. Eleanor stomped off, sputtering about legal action and lawsuits, but the damage was done. Her daughter's wedding was a viral meme waiting to happen. The neighborhood was buzzing before the sun even set. People posted photos of the bubbles, the collapsed cake, and Eleanor's lone shoe floating in the deep end. One guy made a remix video of her screaming, auto-tuned to some pop song. The whole thing blew up in our local Facebook group. Comments ranged from "Pool guy is my hero" to "Eleanor should be banned from every HOA in the state." Someone even offered to bring margaritas to my next barbecue. I didn't say no. That night, I walked around the backyard, still damp from the foam, and felt a strange kind of peace. Not because I'd won some petty war, but because I'd stood my ground. I didn't yell, I didn't get violent, I didn't even need a lawyer. I just used her arrogance against her. She thought she could take over my space, my time, and my home because she wore a blazer and had a title. But when the bubbles hit the water, All her power vanished with them. The pool had never looked so beautiful. And the best part? It still smelled like lavender for 3 days. The next morning, the aftermath looked like a scene from a surreal art film. Foam clung to the hedges like ghostly spiderwebs. One of the folding chairs had been blown into the shallow end, now barely visible beneath a few stubborn patches of lingering suds. My backyard, once hijacked for a wedding, now looked like it had hosted a detergent explosion. But I was relaxed, coffee in hand, watching birds return to the feeder like nothing had happened. For a moment, the world was back to normal. That was until I heard the angry stomp of high heels approaching from the gate. It was Eleanor, of course. She stood there, arms crossed, hair frazzled, her suit jacket blotched with dried foam. Her eyes were bloodshot, either from crying or rage, and she didn't waste any time launching into a tirade. She accused me of sabotage, public humiliation, and emotional cruelty. She ranted about property values, her daughter's ruined wedding, and how the community would never forgive this. I didn't say a word. I just stood there sipping my coffee while she seethed. Eventually, she ran out of steam. That's when I asked her the simplest question. Why didn't you just ask? She blinked, confused. Ask for what? I gestured around the backyard. To use the pool. To borrow the space. To work something out like normal people do. Instead, you forged a contract, lied to your guests, and treated my home like a public park. She scoffed, as if the idea of asking permission was beneath her. That told me everything I needed to know. That afternoon, I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, not because I expected them to press charges, though they could have, but because I wanted it on record. The trespassing, the forged documents, the unauthorized event, everything. I submitted the video footage from my porch camera, copies of the fake letter, and photos of the wedding chaos. Sheriff Davies, a no-nonsense man with a cowboy mustache and a dry sense of humor, called me personally. He said it was the most ridiculous report he'd read in 20 years, but I'd done everything by the book. His words were, "You've been more patient than I would have been." That was satisfying enough. But the story didn't end there. Eleanor predictably tried to spin the whole situation in her favor. She held an emergency HOA meeting the following day, where she claimed I had maliciously tampered with the wedding as a form of neighborhood intimidation. She even claimed I was a repeat nuisance to the community. The problem was, I wasn't in the community. I didn't live in Willow Creek Estates. My house sat outside the HOA border by exactly 32 feet. Her rules didn't apply to me, but she refused to accept that. So she doubled down, attempting to file a formal complaint with the HOA against a person who didn't even live under their jurisdiction. That's when things started to turn. A few members of the HOA board, who had been blindly loyal to Eleanor for years, began to question her behavior. One of them, a woman named Susan Miller who had always kept her head down, finally spoke up. She said the HOA had overstepped its bounds, that forging agreements and staging events on non-HOA property was illegal, unethical, and frankly embarrassing for the community. Eleanor tried to shut her down, but others chimed in. Apparently, the wedding fiasco had caused a ripple effect. Guests had complained. Photos of the bubble-filled ceremony had gone viral. Some of the board members' own friends were now mocking them in group chats. The tide was shifting. Then came the cherry on top. One of the guests, an uncle of the groom, had recorded the entire bubble disaster on his phone, and his teenage son edited it into a TikTok montage set to dramatic opera music. It exploded online. Thousands of views, dozens of duets, comments like, "This is the most satisfying HOA story I've ever seen," and Eleanor got exactly what she deserved. That video reached people in our town who had never even heard of Willow Creek Estates. Suddenly, it wasn't just a neighborhood squabble, it was public humiliation, and Eleanor's face was in every frame. Within days, I noticed something strange. HOA members started showing up at my door, not to complain, but to apologize. First came Susan, holding a pie, as if that would erase years of nonsense. She admitted Eleanor had become too extreme, too controlling, and that a lot of people in the community had just been going along with her to avoid getting fined or ostracized. Then came Robert, a soft-spoken retired veteran, who told me Eleanor had misused HOA funds to cover some of the wedding expenses, claiming they were for a community outreach program. That wasn't just unethical, that was embezzlement. It didn't take long for whispers to turn into meetings. A special session of the HOA was called, And this time, Eleanor didn't control the room. People were tired of her power plays, her ego, and the embarrassment she had brought to their once quiet, suburban utopia. The board members voted to remove her as president. The motion passed unanimously. Eleanor's face, I was told, turned the same shade of red as the chair cushions she once fined a neighbor for not replacing. And that, it seemed, was the breaking point. But she didn't go quietly. Oh no, she tried to sue me. She sent a cease and desist letter claiming damages, emotional distress, and public defamation. My lawyer laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. He sent back a letter so blisteringly polite it might as well have been dipped in acid. We countered with a detailed list of her actions: trespassing, forgery, misuse of HOA funds, harassment, and reputational damage. He included a request for a formal apology and a donation to a local animal shelter as a goodwill gesture. Eleanor didn't respond. She knew she'd lost. A week later, a moving truck pulled up in front of her house. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching silently as furniture was carried out piece by piece. No one waved. No one helped. Eleanor left without saying a word to anyone. Just like that, she was gone. It was over. The HOA was under new leadership, and I, the man with the soap-covered pool, was free to enjoy my backyard in peace. That weekend, I threw a barbecue, not out of spite, but out of celebration. The new HOA board even showed up, cautiously optimistic that peace had been restored. We had grilled burgers, cold beers, and a pool that was finally foam-free. Someone brought a speaker and played that opera song from the viral video. We laughed. We relaxed. We healed. As the sun set, I looked out over the yard, the same yard that had nearly been stolen from me by arrogance and entitlement, and I felt proud. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't given up. I'd fought back without raising my voice, without breaking the law. I'd used patience, planning, and a ridiculous amount of bubbles to protect what was mine. And in doing so, I'd exposed the kind of person Eleanor really was. There are people who believe that power gives them permission, that status means control, that rules are for others, not themselves. Eleanor was one of those people. But sometimes, the best way to deal with someone like that isn't with fists or fury. Sometimes it's with soap, with planning, with poetic justice that floats on the surface of your pool and leaves behind the faint scent of victory and lavender. The days following Eleanor's spectacular downfall were some of the most peaceful I'd experienced in years. The chaos was over, the foam had finally rinsed away, and the neighborhood felt like it could breathe again. But beneath that calm surface was the lingering sense of something more profound. It wasn't just about a ruined wedding or a power-crazed HOA president. This whole ordeal had revealed the cracks in a system so many people blindly followed. Eleanor's obsession with control had infected everything around her, and now that she was gone, people were beginning to wake up from whatever spell they had been under. To my surprise, I started receiving thank you notes. Literal handwritten letters slid into my mailbox, thanking me for standing up to Eleanor. One neighbor wrote that she'd been fined for having wind chimes and always felt like she was walking on eggshells in her own front yard. Another said he'd been written up 3 times for letting his dog bark past sunset. These were people who had lived in fear of an HOA that had stopped serving the community and started serving Eleanor's ego. Apparently, my bubble stunt wasn't just funny, it was cathartic. It had given them permission to say, enough. The new HOA president, a soft-spoken man named Michael who had quietly tolerated Eleanor's antics for too long, stopped by to apologize personally. He said he hadn't realized how far she'd gone until the wedding disaster made it impossible to ignore. He looked tired, like someone who just emerged from a long storm and was now tasked with cleaning up the debris. He told me the HOA board had voted to audit every single expense from the past year. Eleanor's forged contracts, shady vendor payments, and unauthorized party rentals were all under scrutiny now. It was clear that her bubble bath wedding wasn't the first time she'd crossed the line. It was just the first time she got caught in front of an audience. Then came the most unexpected moment of all. The sheriff showed up again, not with a citation or complaint, but with a grin and a pie from his wife. She watched the whole thing unfold on Facebook, he said. Thought it was brilliant. I laughed and invited him in for coffee. We sat on the porch, talking about the ridiculousness of it all, and he told me something that stuck with me. You didn't just stand up to her. You exposed her. And people like her, they thrive in silence. You took that away. Meanwhile, Eleanor had vanished like smoke. Her house went up for sale almost immediately, though no official statement was ever made. Some said she'd moved out of embarrassment. Others claimed she was quietly pressured to leave by the very people who once supported her. The truth probably lay somewhere in the middle. One thing was certain: she was gone. And with her departure came an almost eerie transformation in the neighborhood. Lawns got a little longer. Wind chimes returned. Kids played in front yards again without the fear of receiving a formal warning about noise levels. For the first time in years, people seemed genuinely happy, free. It was like the community had shrugged off a heavy coat and realized just how cold it had been underneath. I could have let it go there. I could have gone back to gardening, grilling, and floating in my pool with a cold drink. But something inside me had shifted too. I had become a symbol of resistance, whether I wanted to be or not. So I decided to lean in, just a little. I had a new sign made, large, bold, and placed right by the fence line where Eleanor once stood with her clipboard. It read, "Welcome to my pool. No HOA. No bull. Just bubbles." Within a day, people were stopping by to take pictures with it. Even the local paper ran a story, "The pool that popped the HOA." I'd never meant to be a hero, but I wasn't about to deny the satisfaction of poetic justice. The weekly farmers market I hosted on my property, which had been a small side project, suddenly tripled in attendance. Locals who had never visited before came to shake my hand, buy fresh eggs, and thank me for the entertainment. A local band offered to play for free. Kids got pony rides. It wasn't just a market anymore. It was a celebration of freedom. My farm became a gathering place. A spot that once represented personal solitude now turned into a communal symbol of taking back control. Still, part of me kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. People like Eleanor don't just disappear. They regroup, they scheme. And sure enough, a few weeks later, I got a message from a friend who lived 2 towns over. You'll never guess who moved into Oak Ridge. Turns out Eleanor had tried to restart her little empire in a new community. But this time, she wasn't the queen bee. Oak Ridge already had an HOA president, a retired attorney known for cracking down on anyone who stepped out of line. Eleanor, predictably, didn't last long. Rumor had it she was fined for parking her car 2 inches over the curb and cited for using unauthorized garden gnomes. The irony was delicious. As the weeks rolled on, life settled back into something resembling normal, but it wasn't the same as before. It was better. I'd gained new friends, deeper respect from neighbors, and a reputation that oddly worked in my favor. Even those who once viewed me as the grumpy guy who didn't want to join the HOA now saw me differently. I was the guy who stood his ground, who didn't cower to nonsense, and who could orchestrate a perfectly timed soap spectacle without breaking a single law. Looking back, I never set out to start a neighborhood rebellion. I just wanted to enjoy my backyard without someone else deciding how it should look or who could use it. But that's how these things go. You draw a line to protect your peace, and suddenly you've started a movement. The truth is, Eleanor gave me a gift, not her poolside decorations or her caterer drama, but a moment that reminded everyone around her that rules without reason are just noise, that authority without accountability is meaningless, and that when someone tries to take from you with entitlement instead of respect, they deserve whatever poetic, bubbly justice you can muster. I didn't destroy her wedding, she did. I simply gave her exactly what she brought to my door: chaos, arrogance, and an unshakable belief that she could take whatever she wanted. But unlike her, I made sure everyone had a front row seat when the consequences came crashing down. And somewhere, in a moving van packed with dry cleaning bills and broken dreams, Eleanor knew it too.